And on behalf of the Canada-Palestine Support Network, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. Thank you so much for coming. Tonight's forum is called 40 Years of Occupation and the Prospects for Peace. CanPalNet has organized tonight's event, and with solidarity organizations in the Lower Mainland, there are several other events that are marking the 40 years of Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem.
I think people are fairly familiar at this point of Canada's position in regards to the sanctions regime that's been leveled at the Palestinians for making the mistake of democratically electing a party that the Canadian government and the European Union and the United States disagreed with. But the UN Human Rights Commission has called the sanctions regime imposed on the Palestinians, which is incidentally the first ever imposed on an already occupied population. Generally, sanctions are a tool to end occupations, not to reinforce them. But the United Nations Human Rights Council called them, quote, possibly the most rigorous form of international sanctions imposed in modern times. That's fairly diplomatic language, because when you impose sanctions on a national liberation struggle, it's very different than the sanctions regimes that we saw brutalize a place like Iraq throughout the 1990s. And there's no time to talk about these kind of things, but of course Canadian frigates in the Persian Gulf were enforcing that sanctions regime against Iraq, stopping things like rubber balls and diapers and potties and such from getting. These are dual-use items that Canada stopped from getting in. Of course, Canadian bombers dropped bombs in Iraq during the Gulf War in 1991. We were involved in the war and the disintegration of Yugoslavia throughout the 1990s, dropping bombs ultimately in Kosovo, which was, despite the fact that the Iraq War was framed as the disintegration of international law under the American hegemony of the world, we can remember back that 1999's war on Kosovo was actually without a UN mandate and was actually really the pillar that broke down United Nations humanitarian law up to that point. So Peter MacKay says immediately after Hamas is elected, not one red cent to Hamas. So what does that mean? Of course, it means not one red cent to the Palestinian Authority, which is not a state and is completely dependent on international aid to exist at all. So that means not one red cent to 1,600 Palestinian schools, many of which I've witnessed have 3 shifts of school because there's not enough classrooms for all the kids. That means not one red cent to 438 hospitals and clinics. Palestinians call them hospitals, but I would hardly call them even a clinic. In many of the refugee camps, there's nothing like a hospital in the refugee camps where the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian population live. This is a sanctions regime that was prefaced by Dov Weisglass, who is essentially the Karl Rove to Olmert and Sharon's government, when he said that what we need to do is have the Palestinians consult a dietitian. He said we want them to, quote, lose weight but not to starve to death. Well, the World Food Program just issued a report recently where they said 1.1 million out of 1.4 million people in the Gaza Strip are totally dependent on food aid, quote, without which they are liable to starve. Right, exactly as Dov Weisglass said, enforced by Canada. Oxfam just released a report that said 50% of Palestinian families in the West Bank and Gaza Strip have seen their annual income in the year 2006 drop by 50%. So people can, again, imagine for a moment what it would be like if you lost 50% of your income, and then that's half the population. It's a siege warfare that's being inflicted on the Gaza Strip and West Bank, and of course we talked about international law all night, but siege warfare was literally the first form of international law in dealing with laws of war and conflict, that it was illegal and immoral and impractical as a tactic of war to starve a population to death. This is the oldest form of international law in Canada, dubiously on the wrong side of that. So what happened in the year 2006? Well, Canada maintained and enforced a sanctions regime against the Palestinians. B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, said that the death toll in the year 2006, 683 Palestinians, 19 Israelis, 11 of whom were in the occupied West Bank. So 683 in essence to 8. That's the toll in a year when sanctions were imposed on the population that saw 683 people killed. You have In 1 month alone, in November of 2006, and people can remember that 2006 was defined as really an attack on Gaza, well, in the West Bank, which almost never made the news, in November of 2006 alone, there was 656 Israeli military raids into the West Bank. There's still 500 checkpoints, and on and on and on. I only have 10 minutes, so I want to try to stay on point. So this is because Hamas was elected, but previous to that, Canada was upstanding towards the Palestinians, unless we're talking about their previous leadership, the Palestine Liberation Organization. In 1974, Yasser Arafat gave a famous speech at the United Nations, which is framed as his gun in the olive branch speech, where he offered national resistance or peace, 1974, which was followed in the United Nations by a vote of 89-8 in favor of Palestinian independence and sovereignty. Canada voted against that. A few hours later, there was a vote about Palestine Liberation Organization gaining observer status at the United Nations, which was a first for a national liberation struggle and quite an impressive achievement for the Palestinians at that time, and Canada chose to vote against that. In 1975, just to sort of take it one step further, there was a United Nations conference being held on crime in Toronto. The United Nations conference are held throughout the world, and it's part of being a United Nations member to hold these conferences. Well, Canada actually refused to hold the conference if the PLO attended the conference as an observer. This is at a time when Time magazine was reporting that 90% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza supported the PLO as their representative. So Canada, again, it wasn't until the mid-1970s that Canada even began to call Palestinians Palestinians and change the language from Arab refugees to Palestinian refugees. And this is on and on. But I want to make sure that people don't think that this is just a conservative policy, because in 2004, Alan Rock stood before the United Nations, addressed the General Assembly, 180 nations, and said that Canada, like Madeleine Albright before him, said that Canada was no longer going to be voting for voting in favor of these Palestinian resolutions on sovereignty and human rights and egregious violations of international law carried out by Israel in their armed conflict in the West Bank and Gaza. And just to sort of reinforce that, after the World Court voted unanimously that the wall that's ghettoizing the Palestinian population was illegal, must be dismantled, and the Palestinians must be compensated, Canada decided to show this policy when they abstained, politically and pointedly abstained from the UN vote that went 150-6 with the United States, Israel, and a few protectorates effectively taking that United Nations resolution off the table. History will not reflect well on Canada being not a part of that resolution as the ghettoization of the Palestinians becomes clear to the world in the decades to come. But the Harper regime is what we're dealing with right now. And in January 2007, while I was in the Gaza Strip, watching the fighting all around me that was supported, as I'll mention, by Canada, Peter MacKay was in Israel meeting with Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, who said that Canada was among Israel's greatest friends in the world for 3 distinct reasons, and these are important for all Canadians. Number one, because of Canada's role in the war in Lebanon, where Canada operated actively discouraged a ceasefire in a war that killed more than 1,000 Lebanese civilians, because that was Israeli policy. Israel didn't want a ceasefire. They wanted to destroy Hezbollah, which is a popular movement and impossible to destroy, and Canada backed that. Number two, the sanctions regime against Hamas. Number three, and this should be important to all Canadians, was that, and in Livni's words, that Canada was, quote, at the vanguard of the isolation of Iran related to the nuclear issue. And DFATE released a press release to us journalists in the area that said, quote, our message in the region is clear. So while MacKay was there, he met with a U.S. general named Lieutenant General Keith Dayton, who is actually the head for the U.S. of the Israel-Palestine region, the head of U.S. security. U.S. has security generals all over the world. And MacKay said that Canada was going to be giving $1.2 million in aid money to the Palestinians. And this would be bypassing the Hamas government as part of what is called the Carney Project. Well, the Carney Project has been openly discussed now 6 months on, and it's essentially essentially to train a proxy force, essentially a coup force that is going to operate without any government authority against the Hamas government. They're going to be trained in order to guard the exits of the ghettos. All of the Palestinian areas are being encircled by a wall, and there's only one way to leave it. So Canada is training the guards that are going to guard the exits to the ghettos. Again, very dishonorable place for Canada. And this is what Condoleezza Rice said while she stood beside Peter MacKay in Jerusalem. She said, "I do know that if Hamas has strong forces and Abbas does not, that is not good for the United States, and it is most certainly not good for Israel." She said, "There are Canadian counterparts in the army who are working closely with Dayton, and it was a joke amongst Canada staffers that half the corps that was training, the officers that are training this Palestine coup force, are Canadian." And that shouldn't be surprising to Canadians when we have forces operating in Haiti, we have forces training Iraqi forces, security forces, so-called security forces in Jordan, and you have the training, of course, of the Afghan army as a principle of Canada's occupation of Afghanistan. This is what Sean McCormick, the State Department spokesperson in charge of the portfolio for training this security force that Canada is involved in. He said, he said this at a press conference, "You have Keith Dayton, General Dayton, on the ground in Palestine who continues to work on the real down-in-the-weeds, blocking and tackling work of helping to build up security forces. Now that may not be very newsworthy in terms of big headlines flashed across the newspaper or the lead story on the nightly news, but it's important and essential work." So this is Canada intimately involved in important and essential work of training a force to operate against the government for the main reason, number one, the sanctions regime that Canada has imposed over the last year has clearly failed to dislodge Hamas. In fact, it's probably strengthened Hamas while destroying the Palestinian economy and the possibility of a sovereign state emerging. And so it's necessary to move on to the second stage, and that is violent overthrow. Again, none of this should be surprising. If we were talking about the United States, this wouldn't be controversial at all. But however, talking for some reason in Canada to a Canadian audience, that Canada's role around the world acts against the interests of national liberation movements and people's struggles is somehow controversial, and I want to just keep that in mind. Canada's playing an integral role and is deeply proud of it, and you can see it all through their foreign policy statements. Thank you.